The CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media. William Colby, Director of the CIA, 1973 to 1976. You're holding a newspaper, any newspaper. You read about a foreign government becoming unstable, a leader who can't be trusted, a war that had to happen, protests erupting in a country you've barely thought about, a scientist whose research is suddenly discredited, a politician whose career ends overnight because of a scandal that appears from nowhere. Now imagine that every single one of those stories, the words, the framing, the emotional weight, the conclusion, wasn't shaped by a journalist. It was shaped by an intelligence officer sitting in a building in Langley, Virginia. Not fabricated outright, not entirely false, just guided, carefully, persistently, over decades. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This is documented history, confirmed by Senate investigations, declassified CIA files, and the admissions of people who built the operation themselves. This is Operation Mockingbird. And once you understand what it was, you will never read the news the same way again. To understand how Mockingbird was built, you first need to understand the psychological atmosphere of 1947 America, because without that atmosphere, nothing that followed makes sense. World War II had ended 2 years earlier. The United States had emerged as the dominant military and economic power on the planet, but the victory felt fragile almost immediately. The Soviet Union, which had been an essential ally against Nazi Germany, had by 1946 already become the central threat in Washington's strategic thinking. Churchill had given his Iron Curtain speech. Greece was in the middle of a civil war with communist forces. Turkey was under Soviet pressure. France and Italy had large, active communist parties that were winning municipal elections. And the most frightening thing about the Soviet threat, from Washington's perspective, wasn't military. It was ideological. The Soviets were winning arguments. In Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, the narrative of American capitalism versus Soviet communism was not a clear victory for the American side. There were intellectuals, workers, students, entire political movements across the world who genuinely believed that the Soviet model represented the future. Washington needed to counter that. It needed to counter it not with bombs, but with ideas, with stories, with the invisible architecture of public perception. On July 26, 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act into law. This created the Central Intelligence Agency, the first permanent foreign intelligence agency in American history. The CIA's mandate, as written, was gathering foreign intelligence. Domestic operations were explicitly prohibited. The agency was not supposed to have any power inside the United States. That prohibition lasted about as long as it took the ink to dry. Within months of the CIA's founding, a small group of officials began quietly building something the law had never anticipated, and had specifically tried to prevent. The man at the center of this story is not a household name. He should be. Frank Wisner was born in 1909 in Laurel, Mississippi. He was a lawyer by training, a patrician by temperament, the kind of man who moved easily through the elite rooms of Washington and New York. During World War II, he served with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the CIA's wartime predecessor. He was stationed in Romania in the final years of the war and watched, helplessly, as Soviet forces moved in and systematically dismantled the government he had been working with. That experience left a permanent mark. People who knew Wisner in those years described a man who came back from Romania transformed, carrying a cold, deep fury at Soviet expansionism that never left him. He was not an ideologue in the conventional sense. He was something more dangerous, a true believer with operational skills. In 1948, Wisner was appointed to lead a newly created CIA unit called the Office of Policy Coordination. The name was chosen specifically to mean nothing. The mandate, however, was extraordinary. In June 1948, the National Security Council issued Directive NSC 10/2. This document, now declassified and readable in full online, authorized Wisner's office to conduct, and I am reading directly from the text, propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direct action including sabotage, demolition, and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance movements, guerrillas, and refugee liberation groups. propaganda, sabotage, subversion. These were the officially authorized tools of an office that was nominally prohibited from operating domestically, and that answered to no congressional oversight. Wisner understood something that most intelligence officials of his era did not fully grasp. In the modern world, the most powerful weapon was not a bomb. It was a story. A well-placed story in the right newspaper, repeated across enough outlets, absorbed by enough people, could shift public opinion more efficiently than any military operation, and leave no fingerprints. He set about building the infrastructure to do exactly that. Wisner called his media operation the Mighty Wurlitzer, a reference to the enormous pipe organs manufactured by the Rudolf Wurlitzer Company, instruments capable of producing any sound, filling any space, controlled entirely from a single keyboard. The metaphor was precise. The idea was that the CIA could function as that keyboard, playing whatever notes were needed, in whatever combination, across a vast network of media instruments that the public would perceive as entirely independent. The mechanics were straightforward, even if the execution was complex. You did not need to control an entire newspaper. You needed one trusted person inside it. A reporter who would take a briefing from a CIA contact and transform it into a story. An editor who would kill a piece that the agency found inconvenient. A foreign correspondent who would file dispatches shaped by conversations with embassy staff who were, in fact, intelligence officers. Sometimes these relationships were explicit. The journalist knew they were working with the CIA and accepted payment, access, or career advancement in exchange. Sometimes they were more subtle. A journalist cultivated as a source, fed information selectively, guided without ever being told directly who was doing the guiding. The network that Wisner built over the following years was, by any measure, remarkable. According to Carl Bernstein's landmark 1977 investigation for Rolling Stone, which drew on CIA internal documents and direct interviews with current and former agency officials, at its peak, the program involved over 400 journalists who had secretly carried out assignments for the CIA. This was not a fringe operation. These were journalists and executives at the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS News, Time Magazine, the Associated Press, Reuters, and dozens of other major outlets. Among the most significant relationships was the one with Philip Graham, publisher of the Washington Post. Graham was not merely a passive collaborator. According to multiple biographical accounts and former CIA officials, he actively helped recruit other journalists into the network and served as a key liaison between Wisner's office and the broader Washington press establishment. He understood what was being built and embraced it, convinced, as many of his generation were, that the Cold War required extraordinary measures. Another central figure was Joseph Alsop, one of the most widely read political columnists in mid-century America. Alsop's column ran in hundreds of newspapers and reached millions of readers. He was also, by his own later acknowledgement, someone whose work was periodically shaped by CIA-provided information and framing. When confronted about this in his later years, Alsop was unapologetic. He believed what he was doing was necessary, that the Soviets were running a vastly larger influence operation, that the free world needed defenders who understood that some rules had to bend. He was not entirely wrong about Soviet operations. He was entirely wrong about whether that justified what he was doing.